Good morning, Mr. Lowenthal. Can we do an audio visual check?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. We'll begin shortly. Thank you.
Can you tell Lisa to come in?
Mr. Chair, whenever we're ready, we can begin the 30-second countdown. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
Good afternoon, everyone. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will come to order. We're meeting today to hear testimony on 5 marine conservation and habitat resilience bills. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chairman and ranking member or their designees. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and keep members on schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first, and hearing no objection, that is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our fully in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes to make an opening statement. Thanks, everyone, for joining us to discuss these 5 bills. All of them today focus on marine conservation, protecting vulnerable marine animals and ecosystems, and increasing climate resiliency. My bill, H.R. 6491, the Salmon Focused Investments in Sustainable Habitats Act, or the Salmon Fish Act as we call it, promotes the vitality of salmon populations by identifying core areas of abundance and pristine habitat and ensuring that they receive the protection, support, and funding they need. In Northern California, salmon have a significant ecological, cultural, and economic role, but their survival is in jeopardy because of habitat degradation, pollution, dams, and climate change. Protecting salmon populations is necessary for their future survival. Tribes, of course, have depended on salmon for centuries. Commercial fishers rely on healthy salmon fisheries for their livelihoods, and recreational anglers like myself, of course, love to spend their free time on the water casting for salmon. And the Salmon Fish Act directs Noaa and the Fish and Wildlife Service to collaborate with other federal agencies, with tribes, with states, and with NGOs to identify areas of high-quality salmon habitat and protect them from destructive activities. The bill additionally creates a grant program that provides resources for restoring and conserving these areas and for watershed health. You know, as the adage goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And so many of our salmon runs are on life support because for decades, we allowed habitat to be degraded and we really only took action when there was a threat of extinction. We cannot keep waiting until prime salmon habitat is irreparably damaged to invest in life support. We need to protect high-quality salmon habitat proactively. That's what that bill is all about. Continuing the important topic of salmon, Representative Don Young's bill, H.R. 6651, the Alaska Salmon Research Task Force Act, establishes a new task force to help identify strategies for conserving Alaska salmon. Prioritizing scientific research needs and collaboration for Pacific salmon conservation efforts in Alaska remains fundamental for protecting and sustaining their populations. H.R. 6987, Representative Larson's bill, titled Protecting Our Marine Mammals Act, would leverage advances in technology to monitor and protect marine mammals. Marine mammals are a critical component of our ocean ecosystems, but without additional protections, some endangered mammals, like the iconic southern resident killer whale, will continue to be in harm's way. Only 74 southern resident killer whales remain. The need to protect these endangered creatures and ensure their longevity has brought bipartisan support for this legislation. The bill capitalizes on cutting-edge technologies to reduce threats to whales, including underwater soundscape monitoring, near real-time tracking, mitigation measures to help ships avoid whales, and grants to promote research and development of noise-reducing technology. On the theme of marine mammal conservation, Congressman Seth Moulton's bill, H.R. 6786, the Whale Coexistence Act of 2022, is common sense legislation that should have been enacted years ago. Since 2010, the North Atlantic right whale population has declined due to emerging threats from ship strikes, fishing gear entanglements, and underwater noise. You may recall our former colleague Joe Cunningham in this hearing room with an air horn in 2019, demonstrating the harmful effects of ocean noise. At the time of the hearing, there were around 420 right whales remaining, and sadly, today that number has declined to 336, and that's in less than 3 years. The bill authorizes $15 million annually to develop, test, and implement innovative technologies and strategies to reduce entanglements and vessel collisions. I want to thank Representative Moulton and members of our committee for taking the lead on developing this legislation. Finally, we'll hear from Representative Chris Pappas on his bill, which is bipartisan, H.R. 3431, increasing community access to resiliency grants. As climate impacts worsen, coastal communities need to mitigate the environmental and economic effects of rising sea levels and changing weather patterns. This bill increases accessibility for NOAA-administered grant programs that help states, tribes, indigenous, and local communities with climate change planning, so those who need financial support for climate mitigation know where to find it. I'm eager to hear from my colleagues about their bills, and I look forward to the invaluable testimony of our invited witnesses. And with that, I'll turn it over to the ranking member for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me comment first of all on how great it is to see you in person. Everyone's escaped from the metaverse, which I'm very happy about, and we're here. Today, we are considering 5 bills, 3 of which would authorize new taxpayer-funded grant programs. While well-intentioned, I can't help but notice that these bills mostly focus on providing taxpayer money as a Band-Aid for species management without streamlining the underlying federal regulatory structure that could help. Such streamlining could help both species and people. One bill, H.R. 6651, introduced by the Dean of the House, Mr. Young, provides a different solution. Instead, his bills seek scientific answers and recommendations to resolve declining salmon runs in Alaska. I recognize that salmon are important to Alaskans due to their cultural, economic, and recreational value, and commend Mr. Young for introducing his bill. Speaking of salmon, we will also be considering H.R. 6491, introduced by the chair, Congressman Huffman. This bill would establish salmon conservation areas and so-called strongholds and provide grants for habitat restoration projects in these areas. On its face, the bill appears well-intentioned. However, as currently drafted, there's no requirement for salmon conservation areas to actually have salmon in them or that the watershed be currently suitable for salmon. Just as concerning is that these designations could be made without input from water users in the watershed. H.R. 3431 by Mr. Pappas requires that Noaa create a centralized website that makes public all Noaa and other federal agency grants for resiliency, adaptation, and mitigation of climate change and sea level rise. H.R. 6785 by Mr. Moulton creates a new grant program for projects to conserve the endangered North Atlantic right whales. And lastly, we have H.R. 6987 by Mr. Larson, which would create several grant programs intended to address impacts to marine mammals. As Republicans have mentioned many times before, we have serious concerns over grant programs that have low or no or non-federal cost shares that can be waived. Our witness, Mr. Rick Marks, will provide important insights on the potential implications to the commercial fishing sector. I look forward to him sharing his expertise with us today. In closing, I want to thank the chairman for limiting the number of bills we are considering today. Some of our previous legislative hearings have included anywhere between 8 to 14 bills, limiting our ability to have a robust discussion on each bill's merits. While we still have hope more Republican bills aimed at regulatory side of this species picture will be included in future hearings, this is a small step in the right direction. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back the remainder of my time.
I thank the ranking member. We'll now move on to our first panel. We're going to hear from members of Congress to speak to their bills on the agenda. However, I have already given an opening statement, so I will not be speaking to my bill. Our first witness is going to be Representative Larson from the state of Washington. We'll hear about his bill, H.R. 6987, to establish programs to reduce the impacts of vessel traffic and underwater noise on marine mammals and other purposes. Representative Larson, welcome to the subcommittee. You're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about H.R. 6987, the Protecting Our Marine Mammals Act. Marine mammals, like the southern resident killer whale in the Puget Sound, face a variety of threats from human impacts, such as boat strikes and habitat destruction. These mammals are important cultural symbols. They're environmental linchpins nationwide and certainly in the Pacific Northwest. So over the course of the past year, I've worked within the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Subcommittee to advance legislation that would protect marine mammals and other endangered species. And earlier this month, offered an amendment to the 2022 Coast Guard Authorization Act that offers enhanced protections for these species. So while that language is a step in the right direction, I was heartened to have an offer from the ranking member of this full committee to work with all of you to build upon that language. So I introduced a standalone bill, 6987, the Protecting Our Marine Mammals Act, to be considered by this subcommittee for potential future inclusion in the Coast Guard bill as that bill moves to the floor. And I would just ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chair, to enter in the record the following letters of support for the bill from the Port of Seattle, the Orca Salmon Alliance, and a joint aquarium letter from 11 national aquariums.
Without objection.
Thank you. This legislation before you contains multiple provisions that build upon ongoing conservation science and technology measures. Commercial shipping is thought to contribute up to 75% of human-caused underwater noise pollution. Vessel noise is monitored in part by the Ocean Noise Reference Station Network. This multi-agency partnership monitors ambient underwater sound, contributing to the protection and management of marine life. This bill authorizes funding to expand that network beyond its current 12 locations by leveraging federal and non-federal monitoring systems that make up the Integrated Ocean Observing System. The bill provides assistance to seaports to minimize vessel impacts on marine mammals. where ports play a significant role in minimizing interactions between vessels and marine mammals. The Quiet Sound program in the Puget Sound is designed, as an example, to reduce vessel noise and disturbance on southern resident killer whales. This initiative is based on the ECHO program, which is run by the British Columbia's Vancouver port, and other ports in the country have similar programs. The bill establishes grants to assist ports across the nation to establish and expand successful initiatives like these to further reduce threats to marine mammals. Accurate data and being able to share that data are instrumental as well. New technologies such as acoustic monitoring, autonomous vessels, and drones can provide near real-time data on the location of marine mammals, and this bill will establish a new monitoring program to design and deploy these technologies to detect whales and other species. The data will be used by vessel operators, monitoring bodies, and other stakeholders to directly inform mitigation measures in near real time to help avoid and minimize vessel and mammal interactions. And as ship designs continue to evolve, that evolution will lead to vessels that are closer to being carbon-free. Another benefit of these new designs is that they will produce less noise. The bill also establishes grants under the Maritime Administration to help spur research, development, and deployment of technologies that reduce vessel noise. And finally, the U.S. Navy has developed technologies that will contribute to the reduction of noise of its vessels. So there's a lot going on. I just want to say, moving forward, it's vital to make the most of existing resources to provide better protections. It's also important to encourage the use of new techniques and new technologies. The good news is that this bill already passed the House as part of last year's House-passed National Defense Authorization Act just a few months ago. However, it was stripped out in the conference committee by the Senate. So it's my hope that we can build on the effort that we started last year to include these provisions in this year's 2002 Coast Guard Authorization Act as we further develop that bill for the floor action very soon. And I hope that the subcommittee will see kindly upon this bill and move it forward so we can get it built into the Coast Guard bill. And I want to thank you all for the time, and especially thank Mr. Westerman, the ranking member of the full committee, for working with me on this issue and on the process here in the House of Representatives. I look forward to working with you to find solutions to protect these endangered marine mammals. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Any questions of Mr. Larson about his bill? Seeing none, we will thank you and move on to our next panel. Thank you for your concern about the southern resident orca population. Remind me, what do they eat?
Salmon.
Yeah, so if
Actually, a wild Chinook salmon.
Yeah, so if you care about orcas, you really should care about salmon.
And by the way, I also eat wild Chinook salmon.
Thank you for that.
No.
Okay. So we will move on to our second panel to hear testimony from administration witnesses. Let me remind witnesses that under our committee rules, you should limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will appear in the record. When you begin, the timer will also begin. It turns orange when you have 1 minute left. And I recommend that members who are joining us online remotely lock the timer so that it remains visible. After the witness's testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself. And I will have the entire panel finish before we bring it back to the members for questions. Our administration witness today is Ms. Janet Coit, Assistant Administrator of the National Marine Fisheries Service and Acting Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and Deputy Noaa Administrator. The chair now recognizes Ms. Coit for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding several bills that address fisheries and ocean issues. My name is Janet Coit, and I'm the Assistant Administrator for NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service. Climate change is here. It's accelerating. Sea levels are rising, waters are warming, habitats are degrading, and marine species are shifting. There's much at risk. And so while we work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we also confront the reality that changing climate conditions are already having significant impacts on our oceans and on our nation's valuable fisheries and protected resources. For example, California is in the midst of a historic drought, and the impacts on salmon in California's Central Valley have been dire. while over 10,000 endangered winter-run Chinook salmon in the Sacramento River return to the river to spawn, Noaa Fisheries estimates a record low survival of only 3% of the emerging salmon. Additionally, climate change is affecting marine mammals and their prey. North Atlantic right whales are approaching extinction, with a recent population estimate of fewer than 350 individuals and less than 100 reproductively active females. The whales have altered their distribution patterns, likely in response to changes in prey location and availability. And that change, due to warming oceans, has resulted in more conflicts, more vessel strikes, and more entanglements with fishing gear, putting this species at even greater risk. Noaa is committed to doing more to conserve protected species, and we greatly appreciate the support of this committee and the intent of the bills being discussed today. With that in mind, I'd like to turn to the bills. Noaa supports the Salmon Fish Act. Salmon are facing significant challenges, and this bill would complement our ongoing efforts to conserve and recover Pacific and Atlantic salmon populations and their habitats. While we must also target our efforts to those populations in imminent risk of being lost, protecting salmon strongholds is essential to achieving recovery and safeguarding salmon populations against the effects of climate change in the long run. This bill would amplify the work already taking place in collaboration with other federal and state agencies, conservation organizations, and communities, while also providing additional focus and additional funding to restore habitat and offset climate impacts. Noaa supports the Increasing Community Access to Resiliency Grants Act, which will advance our efforts to ensure our grant opportunities are clear and easily accessible to the public, including to underserved communities. We currently engage directly with prospective grant applicants through our public webinars and our direct communication, and believe this bill will expand our work in a meaningful way. Noaa supports the Protecting Our Marine Mammals Act. Noaa currently monitors large whales using a variety of different platforms, including tagging, aerial and vessel surveys, and passive acoustic systems. These monitoring efforts help mitigate threats such as entanglement and vessel strikes. However, we recognize that more needs to be done to achieve real-time management action. With regard to ocean noise, Noaa released an ocean noise strategy in 2016 to ensure that we comprehensively address noise impacts to aquatic species and their habitats. We look forward to working with the committee to ensure that this bill complements the collaborative efforts that are already happening with the U.S. Navy and other partners to address the growing threat of ocean noise. Noaa supports the Alaska Salmon Research Task Force Act. While salmon are managed by the state of Alaska, Noaa's Alaska Fisheries Science Center conducts research on salmon biology, ecology, and the social economic importance of salmon to indigenous communities and other stakeholders. Noaa appreciates greatly the interest from Congress to support a coordinated salmon research strategy in Alaska. We would welcome the opportunity to work with you to ensure that this research task force complements efforts by other salmon task forces organized by the state of Alaska and by indigenous groups. Finally, Noaa supports the Whale Coexistence Act. The grant program created in this bill would further Noaa's efforts to reduce lethal and sublethal effects of human-caused activities on endangered North Atlantic right whales, while also benefiting small businesses and promoting partnerships. We continue to pursue holistic approaches to fulfill our legal responsibility to protect North Atlantic right whales, and we look forward to working with the committee to further those conservation efforts. We appreciate the committee's interest in promoting resilience and in protecting and sustaining the nation's marine fisheries and protected species. Noaa stands ready to work with Congress to address the current and future challenges to our marine ecosystems. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing these bills today.
Thank you, Ms. Coit. We'll now bring it back to the members for questions. Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions, and we will begin with me recognizing myself for the first 5 minutes. Ms. Coit, you talked about cross-agency and multi-stakeholder collaboration. I think we agree that that's essential to ensure that salmon protections are comprehensive and that they're enforced and that things are working. What are the current challenges Noaa faces when collaborating with others to protect productive salmon habitat? And how do you think the Salmon Fish Act would improve on the current consultation and designation system?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for introducing that legislation as well. I know that you participated, as did the ranking member, in a recent conversation around the Klamath, and that was an effort led by the Interior Department to get all the parties together. And promoting long-term conservation really does require all of that process to engage the many players, federal, state, private, tribal, that are involved. I think the way the Salmon Fish Act helps advance and complement what's going on is by focusing on strongholds where there are healthy habitats and strong and diverse populations. It provides an incentive to take action in areas that are doing well with grants and voluntary conservation of land and waters. And I think in that way, it might be just one more way of bringing people to the table around the whole portfolio of efforts that need to occur.
Appreciate that. I want to talk about ocean noise. We've got some bills addressing that subject, and I was alarmed to hear today about how loud our oceans are and the fact that underwater noise is doubling each decade. We've heard from witnesses in this subcommittee that commercial shipping noise is the primary contributor to harmful underwater noise, which interferes, of course, with important biological activities of not only whales, but also important commercial fisheries and other forms of marine life. So with the expansion of the Ocean Noise Reference Station Network as envisioned in HR 6987, will we have the tools that we need to take action and mitigate this problem?
Thank you for that question. I believe the passage of that bill would increase the number of tools in our arsenal and provide further impetus for innovation around some of the research and development that's going on now. I mentioned that we have a strong collaborative partnership with the Navy on surveillance and acoustics, and I think the measures in that bill around working together with ports and the maritime industry around quieting measures and furthering the research and actually these bills in combination, the surveillance and the research to try to avoid conflicts and avoid excessive noise would really advance our work in that area.
Are there other tools you think we need?
Probably.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I think that in talking to the scientists across NOAA, including our oceanic and atmospheric research labs, there is exciting work going on in the sort of development phase. And so I think additional tools will come, and this bill provides funding and impetus to make that happen more quickly.
Yeah, so I understand you do have an ocean noise strategy. I wonder if you could speak to how that strategy addresses underwater noise from commercial shipping. And then specifically, do you regulate commercial shipping noise directly? And if not, why not?
Mr. Chairman, the second half of that question, I think I'll need to get back to you on. It's not an area I'm particularly familiar with. The noise strategy, which is co-led by the National Marine Fisheries Service and our National Ocean Service, it involves both working with partners on science to provide additional knowledge and fill gaps and develop tools to reduce ocean noise. It surrounds decision support tools where we're giving more information out to the community and helping them make decisions that would further quiet or reduce ocean noise. We work with other agencies on management actions, and then just the tool of public outreach to try to educate people, I think, can result in the long run in some benefits.
Okay, and then finally on right whales, do you think the United States and Canada are coordinating enough? Is there more that we should be doing, anything Congress should be doing to make sure that's happening?
We are coordinating quite a bit. I recently had a meeting with the top people at the Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans around science, around adaptive management techniques to learn from one another. They've made significant strides in the last couple of years in regards to their crab fishery in particular. And I think we're making headway working with Canada with the tools that we have.
Okay. Thanks very much. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Benz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's quite the Klamath was mentioned a couple of times, and I'm just curious which of these bills would help the most when it comes to the Klamath.
I would think the Salmon Fish Act would help the most in terms of there's a historic effort now, as we both know, in regard to removing the 4 dams. That would be tremendously impactful. But that alone won't be enough. And so I think restoring habitat further up in the watershed would be a benefit from the Salmon Fish Act.
And I guess the question is, when I look at these bills, they seem to be focused more on the ocean. And I'm just wondering, we hear a lot about how important, of course, the Klamath and its tributaries is to salmon, but not so much when it comes to the ocean. So do these bills address the situation in the ocean that negatively impacts salmon? And if so, is this what you want? Is this what you think is going to help? If not, I'm going to go back to the chairman's question, is what should we be doing?
Yeah, right. So Noaa Fisheries is working hard to understand the full array of science surrounding salmon. And we, in fact, just finished a survey where we were part of the International Year of the Salmon, taking a look at salmon in the marine environment to try to improve understanding. The Salmon Strongholds bill complements essential fish habitat. And of course, it requires input and outreach to states and private partners and scientists. I think it focuses more on the upstream and land and water side of things in terms of the freshwater environments, but there's nothing in it that prevents us from looking at marine environments or certainly nearshore environments.
Right? Is it a fact that the focus is on the upstream area because folks think they can control that space more than they can control the impact or whatever the negative issues are in the ocean?
I would offer that the example I gave in the Central Valley, we've seen recently in several instances really strong returns of adult salmon to spawn and then very poor conditions in the spawning habitat where very few of the juveniles survive. So I think that's the reason with the historic drought that your constituents and others have experienced, the poor conditions in the spawning areas have particular focus. We would expect when we see significant returns to have a much higher percentage of the spawning juvenile return and emerge from the river.
Not that we've reached this point yet, but it seems like if we're busy focusing on rivers and streams and on land habitat as opposed to the oceans, we could be looking at one of those situations where we spend more and more and get less and less when we should be shifting our focus to the ocean. So do you have an idea of which is causing the problem? Which is more impactful on these fish, oceans or streams?
We need a healthy full life cycle for the salmon, and that's a complex question. But in regard to the examples I just gave in the Central Valley or parts of the Pacific, is really the degraded and warm water, that's the significant problem right now. So I think we need to tackle both, and we're learning more. I see that Chairman Young has entered the room. I think the focus on research is something we can all get behind.
So I'm going to turn back. I've actually been with 6491, HR 6491, and I think your testimony states you'd like to work on to further improve the bill's clarity and effectiveness. Can you share with us what you were thinking when you wrote that?
Right, that's the Salmon Fish Act.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Was that the bill number, the Salmon Fish Act that
Yes,
you just referred to?
Yes, that's the one. That's the one.
There's some provisions there in regard to transboundary pollutants and working with Canada. And we have both the Pacific Salmon Treaty and the Columbia River Treaty. And we are concerned that we make sure that those provisions jibe with the existing authorities. And that's what I meant with that comment.
Just hopping ahead to HR 6987, which is the noise bill, it doesn't provide any substantive comments on exactly what Noaa would like to work on related to the bill. Can you provide examples? And I think this came up during the chair's questions also.
Right. I think I'll get back to you on that too. The further, we have a noise strategy as mentioned, and I think this further gets other participants in the private sector and the maritime industry involved, the ports. So to me, it broadens the number of people and the amount of brain power towards this issue.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Case for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair and members, colleagues. Focusing for now on HR 6987, and with apologies to Mr. Huffman and Mr. Young, I don't have as many salmon in my part of the Pacific, but I have a lot of marine mammals. Ms. Coy, there is testimony in the panel to follow. Have you happened to be able to read that written testimony? I'm particularly focused on Mr. Marks's testimony.
I have not read that testimony yet, sir.
Okay. Well, let me. I don't want to steal his thunder, but I'm going to try to summarize some of what he says here. I think, as I interpreted, his basic concern is that much of HR 6987 is unnecessary. I think his basic perspective, as I interpret it, is that a lot of this has already been done, and it's duplicative, unnecessary, and he also says that as to a number of the areas of 6987, he questions whether it is even feasible for Noaa to achieve the mandates of this bill. For example, he's talking about the Noaa monitoring program. He says, question arises as to whether this is even feasible for Noaa and the U.S. Coast Guard to achieve. Do you have the view that Mr. Larson's bill is duplicative and unnecessary, or do you think it takes it to another level in terms of ocean noise? And do you think that what he proposes in that bill is in fact achievable by Noaa and the Coast Guard?
Thank you for that question. Yes, the acute, chronic, and increasing noise in the ocean is something we need more tools to address. And even in terms of some of the technologies that we're working on now to have better monitoring. And I think that, as I said in response to the ranking member's question, I think it provides us additional resources and additional partners and additional tools. We need to keep the noise is part of the ocean habitat that's really affecting and adversely affecting marine mammals. So I think we need to keep at it, and that this bill is helpful in doing that.
So I'm sorry, just if you could maybe be a little bit more specific, what just for my own benefit, what from this bill, this particular bill, what additional tools, what additional resources, what additional requirements would be made available and or put in place that you think would address the incredible increase in noise in our oceans?
I think the pilot monitoring and mitigation project, the grant programs, they would increase our ability to identify and reduce quieting measures. And I think that combined with increased surveillance, and there are more technologies that we're developing for knowing where marine mammals are, would combine to help us do a better job at mitigating noise pollution in the ocean.
Okay, maybe just a generic question. Yeah, are there areas of greater concern to you than others in terms of noise pollution in the ocean, noise concerns? I mean, are there geographic areas? Are there particular species that are more heavily impacted? Are there areas that we really should especially focus on in this particular area?
Thank you for that question. There definitely are. In regard to right whales, for instance, we're involved right now in working with the Bureau of Energy Management to make sure that the ground disturbing activities that create quite a bit of noise aren't coincident with right whales being in that area. So it's a dynamic environment. I could get back to you with specifics about which areas at which times are most important. And I think both of the bills surrounding whales are looking at increasing dynamic management systems so we can do a better job of having measures that are in place when they're most needed.
Okay, thank you very much. And just, I think at some point it would be helpful if the subcommittee doesn't ask you formally, if you could actually get back to us with a response to it, especially Mr. Marks's testimony, because he did put a lot of effort into it, and there's questions to be asked and answered, I hope. Thank you very much. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Ms. Gonzalez-Colon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and happy to see you again here. And I will make my first questions regarding HR 6987, and this bill will allow to work and reduce the impacts of vessel traffic and underwater noise on marine mammals. And among other provisions, this bill will authorize some grant program to Noaa to help seaports reduce the threats of vessel strikes and other disturbances to marine mammals. And as you may be aware, Florida and Puerto Rico may be two of the biggest states that may have a direct impact on manatees. My question here will be, we just got like 12 manatees along our courts that were receiving boat strikes during the last year. And although that number may be small, our manatees will count between 500 and 700. So it's 12 will be a lot. My question will be, given the shared responsibility of Noaa and the Fish and Wildlife Services, the bill would not include the Fish and Wildlife Agency as part of the agreement or the bill. My question is, you do have to coordinate with Coast Guard if this bill is approved, of course, but nothing with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And in the case of the implementing Marine Mammal Protection Act, it is under the jurisdiction of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So can you work together? Do we need to include that agency in this bill in order to Noaa to work hand by hand? Do you have the capacity to do it alone?
Thank you for that question. We work very, very closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in this area and as well as with the Marine Mammal Commission. And I've met multiple times with Dr. Peter Thomas, including on issues of noise and vessel strikes. So we do that and have the authority to do that already. And as you pointed out, even one vessel strike can be a problem when the population is very small. So I think we're in very good shape in terms of authority and ability to cooperate and work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
So do you have authority or jurisdiction over manatees as well?
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has authority over manatees.
But that's the question here.
Yeah.
I'm in favor. I'm in favor of the bill, but having U.S. Fish and Wildlife the authority and jurisdiction over manatees and seeing that species, one of the ones that are going to be affected, at least in Florida and Puerto Rico, do we need to have the other federal agency included in this bill to work because of that jurisdiction, or you can do it alone? That was my question.
I see. Thank you for clarifying. I think our intent would be to work closely with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Whether they should be added specifically to the bill in places is something I'd like to check with our counsel and get back to you on.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. The next question will be on HR 3431, the bill that will establish a centralized website regarding all the grants and programs that are available. And I'm happy to see that because that's one of the main challenge we do have in Puerto Rico. Many stakeholders and organizations may not know what programs are available for them to work that out. My question will be, what are the efforts right now from Noaa currently undertaking to inform and engage with eligible stakeholders about the agency's resiliency-related grant programs as we speak?
And Ms. Coit, could you lean in and speak like real close to the microphone so everyone can hear you? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so right now, our resiliency programs are across Noaa, and we're a very disaggregated organization with many regional offices, and we work with partners and states and have a lot of direct interaction. We also have webinars and consultations. It's very retail, I would say, in terms of trying to get the word out directly. I think what we aim to do and what this bill would accelerate is make sure that our website is also a really easy one-stop shop to get information about grants.
And I support it as well. My I know my time will be expiring. I would love your agency to provide a list of the technical assistance it's been provided today, and what could be included in that website in terms of that kind of outreach. Thank you. Good to see you again. I yield back.
All right, I think the gentlelady at the chair now recognizes Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And my first question is for Ms. Coit from Noaa. First, I want to thank Noaa scientists for recently publishing a peer-reviewed paper showing that the West Coast voluntary speed reduction zone programs seem to work better when these voluntary programs are incentive-based rather than just encouraging ships. That's not surprising to me. However, for example, the incentive-based Blue Whales, Blue Skies program, which I worked on also, still only has a 50% compliance with lowering ship speeds, whether that has to do with a number of ships don't choose to participate in it, or those that do don't always follow the rules. I'm not really sure of that. But the compliance rate is not up to, I believe, what Noaa would like to see, 80 to 95%, which would limit whale strikes enough to sustain their populations. At current rates of compliance, even with these incentive-based programs, which work much better than the non-incentive-based voluntary. But even with these incentive-based programs, approximately 83 whales are killed by vessel strikes each year, which far exceeds NOAA's 2021 sustainable population threshold. So my question really to you is, in order for NOAA to really kind of reduce the whale mortalities below this sustainable threshold, what do you see as the program you'd like to see introduced or focused on to reduce the mortality of whales due to larger vessel strikes?
Thank you for that question. As you pointed out, voluntary speed reduction programs are a good thing, a good first step, but often not as effective as we'd like them to be. For many species, even one vessel strike that results in death is a problem towards our recovery goals. So as we've seen with the North Atlantic right whale, which is declining in population, we really need programs that are mandatory if we're going to have the impact that we want in some of these areas. And our strategies involve both separating whales and vessels and then reducing speed in areas where we have both. So we want to look at the areas where voluntary measures aren't enough, and as encouraged and directed in this bill, a move to mandatory measures where necessary.
I'd just like to follow up with that. As you point out, on the East Coast, they have the we're talking about with the right whale more mandatory programs. On the West Coast, we've relied primarily on voluntary and incentive-based programs to reduce speed. Also on the West Coast, where we're talking about, has the greatest concentration of larger cargo ships, significantly larger than the East Coast. So are you advocating that we move beyond the incentive-based voluntary programs to mandatory programs in these corridors on the West Coast?
Thank you. I'm not advocating, rather than suggesting that where we have vulnerable populations and a vessel strike problem, we need to contemplate moving to mandatory. That's something that we feel is necessary for the North Atlantic right whale, and I think it's something our scientists are continually evaluating in regard to other whale populations in light of what the risks are to those populations.
Thank you. I'm going to continue these questions in the same light in the next panel.
All right, thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. And
I yield
the chair now recognizes Mr. Webster from Florida.
Thank you so much.
There you go.
If I'm on right. Florida has a large coastline, long coastline, one of the largest in the nation. And coastal community.
Mr. Webster, could you speak up just a little? We're having a hard time.
Yeah. How's that?
That's much better.
Okay. So Florida has one of the largest coastlines in the nation. Communities, coastal communities have about 75% of the population of the whole state. And a lot of the economy from Florida comes from.
Mr. Webster, I'm sorry, we're just not able to hear you. Is there something we can do to your audio settings to crank it up a little? Don Young's going to get very grumpy here if we can't turn the volume up. He's got his cane out.
Hang on.
We'll give you some time to address this.
How's that?
Yeah, if we can keep it at that level, we're good.
Okay, I'll try.
Thank you.
So our natural infrastructure, such as the coral reefs, mangroves, marshes in Florida, are our first line of defense against any kind of harsh weather, extreme weather. Hurricanes can destroy these communities, and I've introduced a bill along with others, HR 3431, which will improve community access to resilient grants, which support restoration efforts in coastal communities. I guess, Ms. Coit, can you describe the way in which Florida's natural infrastructure helps mitigate during hurricane?
Thank you for that question. Nature-based solutions are a big part of Noaa's portfolio when it comes to promoting coastal resilience. Healthy mangroves, healthy reefs, coastal wetlands, restoring and conserving those areas both help buffer against storm impacts and help areas recover from storms. We recently had a report issued that said 1 foot of sea level rise is predicted to occur by 2050. So having these natural habitats provide multiple benefits on the coastline and will help both in terms of the safety of our communities and in the economic vitality. And of course, in protecting the biodiversity, many of these are very rich and important nursery grounds for fisheries.
Well, can you provide some, maybe some success stories that you've had with Coastal Resilience Grant Program?
Our Coastal Resilience Grant Program, which is run out of our Ocean Service, as well as our Community-Based Habitat Restoration Program, has had successes across the country in terms of protecting wetlands and coral reefs, and the infrastructure bill that was recently passed gives us a historic opportunity to scale that up. In regard to specific programs in your neck of the woods, I would have to defer and get back to you on details. I'm familiar with them in the Northeast where I'm from and in other parts of the nation, but mangroves are certainly one of the areas where we're doing a lot of work with partners on restoring those vital habitats. And that would be led by our National Ocean Service.
Great. Look forward to that report. Thank you again, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. The chair now recognizes Mr. Levin for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Coit, I'm proud to represent a congressional district in Southern California with more than 50 miles of beautiful coastline. My district is constantly grappling with issues surrounding coastal resilience, rising sea levels, coastal erosion, etc. While Noaa provides numerous programs to help local communities address climate impacts, they aren't always easily accessible. Can you talk about the barriers you've seen potential grant applicants face when they're looking for coastal resilience funding from Noaa?
Thank you for that question. And of course, our aim is to identify and reduce barriers. And the aim of this administration in terms of equity and working with underserved and disadvantaged communities is to work with them, specifically the people who know and appreciate where the flooding is, where the problems are in terms of identifying plans and portfolios of projects. So I think a couple areas where there are impediments are one, there can be language barriers, of course, when the information that we're providing or the data we're providing is not accessible in terms of a native language. As well, we're trying really hard to make our data products and services things that are both accessible to the public in terms of the websites, but also providing them in the format of tools that can be easily used by people without scientific acumen. So that can be another barrier. And then finally, in regard to the legislation in front of us, I think there's just a wide array of grant programs in the government, and having an ability to easily have a place for people to sort them out and figure out which grant program applies to their goals is something we want to keep working on. Having said that, we try very hard to work with grant applicants to provide them guidance and lead them toward the right programs.
Thank you for that. My great hope is that HR 3431 will help provide coastal communities like ours with the resources they need to mitigate the impact of climate change. Let me shift gears. Marine mammals play a critical role in the function of marine ecosystems, and in 1972, we instituted safeguards for these species as part of the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Sadly, today, marine mammals are facing larger threats than ever and are dying at alarming rates from human-forced changes to their environment. They've been disproportionately impacted by climate change, both directly through loss of habitat or reduction in range of survivable ocean temperatures, and indirectly through relocation and reduction of primary food sources. Could you describe how NOAA's current relationship with the Marine Mammal Commission works, and also how you plan to work together to address the needs of marine mammal protection?
Thank you for that question. The Marine Mammal Protection Commission is a partner with NOAA and established under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, as you mentioned, that is an important source of independent academic independent science. So they both inform and partner with us in terms of providing the latest science and providing recommendations for mitigation measures, conservation measures. So they're a very important partner and integral to the work that we do under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And it's a dynamic area. Right now, we have a number of populations that need additional measures in terms of meeting the goals of their recovery plan. So we're working closely with them as a valued partner.
Thank you very much for your answers. And again, I'd just like to highlight the importance of the coastal resilience funding and coastal erosion in my district, and really appreciate the work being done. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Soto, if he's still with us. Mr. Soto, are you there? We may have lost Mr. Soto. So I think at this point, if there are no other questions, and I don't see any, we will thank Ms. Coit and move on to the third and final panel of expert witnesses. So I will remind non-administration witnesses that you are
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, there's Mr. Soto. No, is it Mr. Soto? There he is.
Yes.
Okay. Well, you're in luck because Ms. Coit had not quite left. So let me recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Coit, for what you're doing to help protect our oceans. You heard already from my fellow Floridian, Congressman Webster, about the importance of Florida oceans and coastal areas, much like critical areas on the East Coast and West Coast. As you may know, we passed the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act out of the House just recently, and thank you, Chairman Huffman and Chair Lowenthal, for all your support of that. That got passed through the American Competes Act. So I look forward to working with you as we get this passed out of the Senate to improve block grants, to lower pollution and grow new reefs, as well as the U.S. Reef Task Force and other emergency disaster relief, we know that the Great Florida Reef is in jeopardy, and it's a critical part. Just this morning, we saw Administrator Coit a new article out of WLRN talking about a new study that has found that 85% of popular grouper and snapper species have been overfished and fallen below sustainable numbers. The study was by researchers from the University of Miami, Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science, and from Noaa itself, modeled from 20 years worth of survey data on 15 species to determine levels needed for the fish to survive. They determined sustainable levels and looked at reproductive capacity of the stock and found that spawning fish need to reach at least 40% of historic levels. Nearly 100% of the fish fell below that level, with some dipping to as low as 5%. In response to this, we saw Noaa respond that the findings would not be used in an ongoing review of federal management practices for reef fish in the Gulf of Mexico because the study was published after recommendations were made by the Gulf of Mexico Fishery Management Council. But the article noted that not using that data could defy rules put in place nearly a decade ago requiring Noaa to use the best and latest science available in developing these rules. So it'd be great to get a little bit of a briefing and response on how we could use updated data and what your plans are in response to Noaa's own study that was published today.
Thank you for that question. And I'm not familiar with the study that you just mentioned that was published today. Generally speaking, when our councils are making decisions, they're making them based on the data and information they have in front of them at the time. However, in regard to red snapper and red grouper, as you're well aware, there are ongoing discussions with all of the Gulf states and Noaa fisheries about how to make sure we're using data from the states and how to make sure that we're updating the data, including looking at places where we may have poor information or mistakes have been made. So it will be my charge to take a look at the best available science and make sure that we're continuing to use that to inform our management. And I will look in further into the study that you mentioned today. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator Coit, especially because it was done in conjunction with Noaa and then simultaneously having an initial comment that it wasn't going to be utilized obviously drew an initial red flag. I appreciate your willingness today to look into the matter. We want to use the most up-to-date information. Florida is a fishing capital of the world, particularly for recreational fishing and for iconic species like red snapper and grouper and others. And we want to make sure we're protecting that recreational opportunity and sustainable proteins for the state and for the nation for the foreseeable future. So I appreciate your commitment today. I'm looking forward to getting more information on the topic. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and Ms. Coit, we will now give you a final thanks and bring our third panel forward. So for the non-administration witnesses, let me remind you that you're encouraged to participate in our Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. I'll also remind witnesses to mute yourself when you're not speaking to avoid inadvertent background noise, please. And I will allow both witnesses to finish before we bring it back to the members for questions. So our first panel will start with Dr. Jessica Redfern, Senior Scientist and Chair of the Spatial Ecology Mapping and Assessment Program at the Anderson Cabot Center. The chair now recognizes Dr. Redfern for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz, for the opportunity to testify today. I am a senior scientist and the chair of the EcoMap program, which is what we call ourselves for short, at the New England Aquarium. The New England Aquarium is a catalyst for global change through innovative scientific research, animal conservation, education, and advocacy for vital and vibrant oceans. I have used statistical models to address wildlife conservation challenges for more than 20 years and have published scientific papers on a broad range of topics, including species habitat modeling, vessel traffic patterns, the risk of vessel striking whales, the risk of fishing gear entangling whales, the risk of vessel noise to whales, and estimating species diversity to guide designation of marine protected areas. My testimony addresses H.R. 6785 and H.R. 6987. Some of the biggest lethal threats to marine mammal populations in United States waters are entanglements in fishing gear and vessel strikes. For some populations, these mortalities exceed the number estimated to be sustainable under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. For example, 50 North Atlantic right whales have been killed or seriously injured since 2017, and this species faces a high risk of extinction. On the West Coast, a dramatic increase in humpback whale entanglements began in 2014 and was associated with changes in distributions caused by a marine heat wave. There are also over 20 observed vessel strikes of fin, humpback, and blue whales on the West Coast in the last 5 years. Sublethal effects of human activity are also a concern for marine mammals and include indirect effects of entanglements, vessel noise, and climate change. For example, studies show that vessel disturbance and noise disrupts foraging by southern resident killer whales. We need immediate conservation action to address these lethal and sublethal threats, including the legislation before you today. Funding is needed for projects that support the coexistence of right whales and human activities. Projects could include the continued development and broad implementation of ropeless fishing, which would reduce entanglement risk and keep the fishing community on the water. Projects could also identify areas of increased vessel strike risk and develop solutions to reduce this risk. Finally, projects could assess the potential effects of wind energy development. H.R. 6785 enables the conservation of right whales and the success of ocean industries by providing the funding needed to support these types of projects. Another solution is near real-time monitoring, which can be used to detect animals and implement measures that reduce the risk of human activities. These systems should include visual sightings, acoustic detections, and habitat modeling. H.R. 6987 establishes a near real-time monitoring program with a pilot project for right whales. This program provides an opportunity to support ocean use because measures that reduce risk can be implemented when animals are detected. While near real-time monitoring can help reduce vessel strikes, vessel speed restrictions are also needed. Programs at seaports have been successful at reducing vessel speeds and reducing vessel noise and air pollution. However, these programs are currently limited to a few locations. Research also suggests that implementing mandatory speed restrictions in areas of high risk, identified using the best available science, will reduce the risk of lethal vessel strikes. Slower vessel speeds also have the added benefit of reducing vessel air pollution and noise. Vessel speed restrictions are not included in H.R. 6987. I encourage the committee to consider additional policy measures that implement mandatory vessel speed restrictions for species at highest risk of vessel strike and disturbance from vessels and noise. In addition to slowing vessels down, other actions are needed to reduce vessel noise. Research in some important whale habitats suggests vessel noise has almost eliminated the acoustic conditions in which whales evolved. Developing vessel quieting technologies can reduce noise. To evaluate the effectiveness of noise reductions, we need to improve our understanding of ocean soundscapes. H.R. 6987 will help reduce risk to marine mammals by increasing our understanding of ocean noise, exploring possibilities for reducing vessel noise, and providing funding for programs that have the potential to reduce vessel impacts on marine mammals. In conclusion, these two bills offer important and timely support for programs that will promote ocean industries and reduce the lethal and sublethal effects of human activities on marine mammals. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Redfern. We'll next hear from the Honorable Stephen Honigman, former General Counsel of the United States Navy. The chair now recognizes Mr. Honigman for 5 minutes. Welcome.
About the impact of man-made sound in the oceans upon whales and other marine life. Based on that experience, I am convinced that it is possible to be a responsible steward of the oceans and the marine life within them, while at the same time fully performed what national defense requires. After leaving the Navy Department, I advised the Natural Resources Defense Council in its production of the film entitled Sonic Sea about the harmful impact of underwater radiated noise upon whales. Sonic Sea received the 2017 Emmy Award for Outstanding Nature Documentary. The views I am expressing today, however, are solely my own. To me, though, the award-winning success of Sonic Sea underscores the importance of the subcommittee's work and the legislation that you are considering today. It compellingly demonstrates that for marine mammals, sound is life. Whales, dolphins, many species of fish rely upon sound to find food, locate mates and offspring, maintain social bounds, and navigate and orient themselves in the sea. But their ability to function is under increasing threat from rising levels of man-made noise in the ocean. A prime contributor to noise pollution in the oceans is cavitation from commercial ships' propellers. Today, roughly 90% of the world's goods are transported by ships. Underwater noise pollution can also put the security of our national naval vessels and their sailors at risk. The excessive noise in the ocean can impede the ability of our warships to detect, localize, and track adversary vessels, including quiet diesel-electric submarines. For that reason, quieter ocean soundscapes are important to the Navy as well as to marine mammals. With these concerns and objectives in mind, I would like to commend Representative Larson and H.R. 6987. It is a forward-looking, thoughtful, and appropriately cost-effective approach to quieting commercial vessels and reducing their harmful impact upon whales, marine mammals, and other species within the oceans. It also provides for appropriate coordination with the Department of Defense to ensure that national security considerations are duly safeguarded. H.R. 6987 motivates and empowers American shipbuilders and designers to do what they can do best: create and improve technologies to solve a genuine, important problem. The coming decade will be an inflection point in commercial shipping technology as the world moves to decarbonize the global merchant fleet. As it meets that challenge, industry needs to invest in research and development that will enable our shipyards to deliver commercial ships that are quiet as well as carbon-free. Because one of the primary causes of underwater noise is the cavitation that commercial ships' propellers produce, switching to electric or eco-friendly fuel engines will not cure the noise that the ship radiates. However, some technologies that enable the ship to move through the water with less friction and thus require less energy and consume less fuel can also contribute to quieting the ship. Current examples include advanced hull and propeller forms and surrounding the ship's hull with bubbles. Financial incentives and competitive recognition for mastering that interplay will help to create a significant leadership position for American industry, a win-win outcome for the inhabitants of the oceans and our environment at large. A logical next step from supporting development of new technology is to use existing technologies more broadly, making warships operate more quietly, making them less vulnerable to detection. The Navy is a state-of-the-art practitioner. Funding the publication of a non-classified report to identify naval technologies will provide ready access to a roster of proven, effective technologies for commercial shipbuilders to include in their new vessel designs. In conclusion, I would like to say that taken as a whole, the programs and technologies that H.R. 6987 is intended to support are an array of effective, timely, and much-needed instruments for reducing oceanic noise and preventing deadly collisions to protect whales, marine mammals, and other marine species from man-made harm. Thank you, and I will be happy to respond to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Honigman. Our final witness will be Ms. Jill Weitz, Campaign Director for Salmon Beyond Borders. Ms. Weitz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and Subcommittee members. Thank you for the invitation to testify in support of the Salmon Fish Act and the Alaska Salmon Research Task Force Act. My name is Jill Weitz, and I join you today on behalf of Salmon State and as the director of its Salmon Beyond Borders campaign in Juneau, Alaska, the ancestral and present homelands of the Taku, Kwan, and Akpon Tlingit peoples. Alaska is our nation's last best place for wild salmon. At Salmon State, we work to ensure that Alaska remains home of the world's healthiest and most abundant wild salmon resource, which provides food, culture, income, employment, and recreation to Alaskans, Americans, and the world. Salmon Beyond Borders is a community-driven campaign that works to defend and sustain transboundary salmon rivers shared between Southeast Alaska and Northwest British Columbia, Canada. These bills create proactive investment opportunities for the research and protection of North America's most outstanding salmon runs in their habitat. Where the U.S. has spent billions of dollars to restore salmon habitat and recover salmon populations in the lower 48, we still have a chance to get it right. Investing in ecosystem scale conservation is the best way for us to have and ensure we have salmon in the future. And Alaska is the biggest salmon stronghold we have left. If you've never had the privilege to visit Alaska, it might be hard to imagine the importance and immensity of its relatively untouched salmon watersheds, but let's give it a try. Bristol Bay Watershed in Southwest Alaska, home of the world's largest sockeye salmon run, creating 15,000 fishing jobs and a $2.2 billion commercial fishing economy. Or the transboundary rivers that originate in the glaciated boreal forests of Northwest British Columbia before spilling out into the temperate rainforest of Southeast Alaska and serving as the lifeblood for the Tongass National Forest. Covering nearly 28,000 square miles, bigger than Ireland, the transboundary Taku, Stikine, and Unuk rivers have served as centers for culture, commerce, and biodiversity since time immemorial, and now represent some of the last remaining watersheds in North America that can truly act as salmon strongholds. All 5 species of Pacific salmon are present in these systems, historically producing 80% of wild Chinook populations throughout the Panhandle. Many of the salmon populations in these rivers remain abundant, productive, and diverse, and contribute to the annual billion-dollar salmon and visitor industries of this region. The Taku River represents one of the largest roadless watersheds in North America. In 2021, even after fishery harvest was complete, over 150,000 sockeye salmon and over 75,000 coho salmon returned to spawn in the Taku. The smaller tributaries feeding the main river represent incredible habitat diversity, ranging from wetland-dominated areas fed by copious coastal rain to rivers fed by some of the largest remaining ice fields on Earth. Watersheds are not immune to emerging pressures brought about in large part by climate change, nor do they have immunity against negative impacts from transboundary pollution originating in Canada. The Salmon Fish Act helps to ensure that we are doing all that we can to proactively address that which we can control, as warmer air temperatures, higher amounts of precipitation, and less snow stored in the mountains will impact salmon populations by changing the way rivers flow, and in some places warming the water in which they spawn and rear. In the Taku and Stikine, nearly 290 miles of new salmon habitat could be created as glaciers recede from their current locations. As a result, conversations about conserving salmon habitat should not only include discussion about present habitat, but also habitat that will be formed in the future, giving them a better chance for survival. Salmon transform the landscapes of which they are a part, bringing nutrients from the Pacific Ocean and providing a seasonal pulse of life that enriches the ecosystem and the way humans act with it for miles around. Proactively protecting healthy salmon habitat is a good investment and is absolutely critical in the race against climate change. Thank you for your focus on these important issues and for the opportunity to provide perspective on these bills. Many thanks in particular to Congressman Young and Congressman Huffman for your work to defend clean water and wild salmon. We support both the Fish Act and the Alaska Salmon Research Task Force Act, as both are critical to the future sustainability of Alaska's salmon runs and the communities, fisheries, and economies that depend upon them. We look forward to working with the committee to advance salmon conservation-related legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. White. And I misspoke a moment ago. Our final witness is actually still with us, and we're going to hear next from Mr. Rick Marks, Director of Government Affairs for Robertson, Monegal, and Eastaw. Mr. Marks, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you for not forgetting me, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Very good. Thank you for having me. Today's comments are my own, informed by the perspectives of some of my clients and my near 30-year career as a scientist and advocate. On HR 6651, I support the effort of the Dean of the House to provide a framework for research and collaboration on Pacific salmon conservation, invoking the philosophy of our 26th president. When faced with a challenging situation, the worst thing you can do is nothing. Congressman Young is trying to do something for salmon in Alaska. The task force will bring together key stakeholders, and at a time in this country when people aren't talking enough, this is a step we should take. Others are also trying. On January 30th, NOAA launched the first of its kind comprehensive oceanographic salmon survey in the Gulf of Alaska. Things are happening that will give us more tools to manage salmon stocks in a changing condition, and we should support the effort with Mr. Young's bill. On HR 6785, the grant component is constructive and should increase collaborative efforts. However, I feel the bill misses the mark on the plankton survey. NOAA already conducts a continuous plankton recorder survey, so the provision appears duplicative. What is missing is inclusion of NOAA's ecosystem monitoring program, where the lipid profile of copepod forage is collected and analyzed. Food distribution and density are obviously critical, but so is the caloric value of available food, which is changing. I recommend the bill be reworked to adequately address the survey component. On HR 6491, Mr. Chairman, I note removal of the need. Your focus on salmon habitat, something we need to try and do. Providing consultation for affected states and tribes is also helpful. However, the bill includes provisions. It creates a public nomination process similar to the 2014 changes to the National Marine Sanctuary Program, which precipitated several concerning nominations. The bill expands well beyond salmon areas and strongholds to the management, restoration, and protection of entire watersheds. This has direct but unknown impacts on water use, property rights, food production, and permitted activities. It also appears that federal funding can also be used to purchase, hold, and transfer water rights and actual property to third-party entities. The bill also mandates use of MSA's marine EFH provision and expand salmon habitat upland to some unknown distance, perhaps all the way to the state of Idaho. And it is unclear how all of these elements mesh with existing statutory authorities, including the MSA and ESA. Finally, HR 6987, first process, then detail. Mr. Chairman, we've seen these concepts morph through several bills going back to summer 21, including efforts to slip this into the 21 and 22 NDAA and U.S. Coast Guard authorizations. So thank you and Ranking Member Bentz for providing some regular order. The bill amends the MMPA to address vessel traffic and noise, which, to Mr. Case's point, I believe does have merit, especially for species like the southern resident killer whale. But it appears to be far more than that. Section 3 creates a program for large whales to reduce the risk of vessel collisions. The first step is a pilot project for North Atlantic right whales, but NOAA already has such a program in place, so the amendment is unnecessary in that regard. In fact, just last month, BOEM announced a multi-agency approach to enhance the existing NOAA program, which already consists of an extensive network of speed reduction zones and timely alerts to mariners, and it appears to be working. The alerts are extensive, and NOAA estimates the 5-year average number of interactions is 1.3 per year, and the data are trendless. The amendment also requires sector-specific mitigation protocols and then expands the pilot program to other large whale species, essentially wherever they exist and if they are impacted by human activity, including mere disturbance, regardless of stock condition. This was the context of my point on the ability of the agencies to handle this expansion to other species. This is an expansion of MMPA protections, which are already highly precautionary and may well result in increased litigation. As written, this amendment could unnecessarily impact commercial fishermen around the country. And in closing, Mr. Chairman, I have one final point. It took nearly a decade for Congress to finally address the very real but geographically limited problem of robust marine mammal populations eating ESA-listed salmon and steelhead on old-growth sturgeon on the Columbia and Willamette rivers. Today, the 117th is poised to adopt this amendment, which is far more expansive, and the extent of our focused discussion is essentially today's hearing, and we barely got that. This is unfortunate, and I hope we will not pass this amendment as written, but either narrow the scope or hold it for a transparent, robust MMP reauthorization debate. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
Mr. Marks, thank you. We'll bring it back to the members for questions now, and I'll begin by recognizing the Dean of the House, Don Young, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for very important issues, especially the Alaskan salmon. The Salmon Beyond Borders did a good job, and my bill I want to talk about in a moment, and I'm going to excuse myself. It's 6651. This bill will create a research task force to study the causes behind the massive declines of salmon runs in Alaska. I have to say, Mr. Chairman, that I've been talking about this for quite a while because for some reason we've concentrated always on shore. And I think we should do that. We should spread our research out into the oceans. Is it climate change? Is it the forage fish? Is it competition? We don't know. Maybe I said one time, maybe it's an old nuclear sub. They had 34 of them out there one time. It's sunk, but we're losing our salmon. We have a great run in Bristol Bay, but we're losing the chum salmon, the Yukon, the Kuskokwim. We lost our king salmon, pretty much all over the state. So I want to find out why it's happening. I'm a little tired, Mr. Chairman, everybody pointing their fingers at one another. That doesn't solve the problem. We have to look at why this is occurring. And if we don't do it, we've lost a great asset to the state of Alaska, this great nation itself. This is a small group. It costs no money because they don't get compensation, but they will have a good group from the governor and from the Secretary of Commerce, and we'll sit down and see if we can find out what is the causes for a decline in our salmon. Just last year, actually January, there was 14 fishery disasters in Alaska. Since 2018, they declared. This is not good. We did catch the largest run of fish last year in Bristol Bay, red salmon, and that was great. But we lost them and losing them all over the areas. We want to find out why, if we can reestablish that, not only for the fish themselves, but for the economy and the culture of my great state. It's needed. This is a simple bill, and I urge the passage of the bill. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for having these hearings. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. And just in response to the comments made by Mr. Marks, I want to clarify that in the Salmon Fish Act, there is specific language posing limitations on any aspect of the bill impacting water rights. The bill also explicitly states that the grant program cannot be used to acquire any private property without explicit consent of property owners. So it is a voluntary program when it comes to private property entirely. If any of that needs clarification, we can work on that, but I think it is sufficiently clear. Ms. Weitz, I want to come back to you about the Salmon Fish Act and ask if you could elaborate on why it's so important to flip the script. We've spent decades playing catch up on the damage we've done to salmon watersheds all over the West. Why is it important that we look at the places that we haven't yet ruined and try to act proactively to prevent them from being ruined?
Thank you, Huffman. And kind of going back to Congressman Young, what he was saying, we are seeing declines all over the state of Alaska, which in my 15 years of living in Alaska, I've seen incredible changes just in that amount of time. Washington State, for example, has spent billions of dollars trying to recover salmon. And while there have been great strides made in recovering some of those populations, some populations still remain on the brink of extinction. And so I think, I mentioned the notion of kind of fixing what has not yet been broken. And we still have, we still, while populations are declining, we still have incredible runs of salmon. And it is because we still have areas that have habitat that is intact. And it is integral that we do it now before it is too late, especially as it relates to the race we are against because of climate change. So now is the time. Now is the time to invest before it is too late to maintain that which is working and has been working well for thousands of years.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Redfern, I'd like to come back to you, talk about the right whales for a moment. Way back in the prior century, in the late 1980s, I was a law student at Boston College, and I was on a Northern Right Whale Advisory Task Force, believe it or not. I worked with one of your colleagues at the New England Aquarium, Scott Krause, in that regard. We were talking about all the same stuff back then. I mean, we knew it was vessel strikes and fishing gear entanglements and that this species was on a terrible trajectory. And it just seems like the same conversation, 30 plus years later. I realize we've got a couple of good bills here that'll help around the edges. I don't mean to diminish the value of the tools that we're discussing today, but this species is in real trouble. And if you could, wave a wand and you had omnipotent power to save the Northern Right Whale, what would you do?
Can I have that wand? That would be fantastic. What I would do right now, if I could, would be to find a way to make ropeless fishing work. I know fishing is important. Everyone loves to enjoy their seafood. The fishing communities have this long history, just like the right whales. So we want to make sure those fishing communities can continue. I believe the future is ropeless fishing. That is really going to reduce entanglement risk. So that's critically important to me. And I think that's why I like HR 6785 so much, because it's going to support projects that help us develop ropeless fishing. That's one way we can address it. I'm also concerned about vessel strikes, and that's why I like both of the bills I testified about, because again, they can help us reduce those risks of vessel strikes. I'm also, I spend a lot of time thinking about wind energy development. We know climate change is impacting right whales, and we know offshore wind is a really important tool we have for reducing the effects of climate change, but we need to make sure that wind energy develops in a manner that's not going to harm right whales. So I also am really interested in making sure that as we start construction here in 2022, it's coming up right off of Massachusetts, that is done in a manner that really, one, we're collecting as much data as we possibly can so we can understand what these potential effects are, and that we use that information to make sure we're really cautious as we move forward and we do this in the right way.
All right, thanks very much. Mr. Honigman, in the time I have left, I'd like to talk about ocean noise, drawing upon your experience at the Department of Defense. What technology does the department have to reduce underwater noise, and do you think that some of these technologies can be transferred to non-government vessels that might be effective in reducing impacts to marine mammals? Do you think the Navy would be supportive of that? What can you say about that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Navy has certain technologies that ought to be transferable. I've mentioned a few of them. Coating the ship's hull with bubbles to enable it to slide through the water. There are technologies called Prairie and Maker Air that are used on warships. Different types of hull forms, different types of propeller forms could also be transferred. There may be technologies that are still classified that don't merit disclosure. But I think this bill does an effective job of creating a roster, a library, so to speak, of technologies that the Navy uses that could be transferred to other vessels owned by the government and also could be used by commercial ship developers for regular commercial ships. I think it's a very fruitful area to explore, and frankly, using developed technologies that already work, I think is a great way to begin.
Thank you, sir. I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and a question for Mr. Marks. Your testimony on HR 6491 notes the potential for expansion of habitat management, restoration, protection, and possible impacts on property and water rights. The chair just mentioned that the bill attempts to limit those impacts. Are you still concerned?
We can't hear you, Mr. Marks.
How about that, Mr.
There you
Chairman?
go.
So many buttons. Sorry about that. I appreciate the question, and I recognize that the chair clarified for us that these projects are voluntary. I understand that. I do have concerns about that in the Columbia River Basin. Obviously, it's a very large, complicated space. You know, probably more than 500,000 acres of irrigated agricultural lands, drinking water sources, probably covers 6 or 7 states. I guess part of my concern is allowing the purchase, holding, and transfer of property and water rights, even if voluntary. I think could see a proliferation of conservancies and NGO-backed land trusts that may have a different philosophy for land use than, say, a farmer in Oregon. So I think it's all about balance. I understand the voluntary component of it. I still have some concerns and reservations about it.
Well, thank you for that. And it reminds me of situations where bills of this nature were used to fund the acquisition of water rights at the upper end of a drainage, and then that water was then chased down through or followed down through the entire drainage, which changed the way that we usually irrigate because we have so much reuse. So I think that may be what you're focusing on. Let's move away from that, though, and to your testimony, the portion that raises concerns regarding 6987, where you talk about real-time monitoring to all large whales. I guess you might comment on just how in the world we might do that, but more importantly, who's listening to the material or the data that we develop? How many of the ships in the ocean actually pay attention to the monitoring that we're doing?
Well, I think the short answer to your second question is the alerts to mariners from Noaa right now on right whales are very extensive. I actually put a copy of one in my written testimony so you can see what they're able to do to communicate to vessel operators. And I think it is having a positive effect. On the broader issue of this legislation, and I think some folks may be talking past each other, the pilot project for North Atlantic right whales is actually having some positive effect. However, what this amendment will do is it will add the formal identification of foraging, breeding, calving, rearing, and migratory habits where whales are impacted by human behavior, not just from vessel collisions. And it requires sector-specific mitigation protocols to reduce these impacts. The strategic plan requires the agency to mitigate impacts to additional whale species that may be disturbed in any of these habitats. And I think this is a very low bar, and I think it could expose the Secretary and the coastal states to litigation pressure from animal rights communities, and we have seen this before. The plan expands these programs to other baleen and toothed whales, and that brings into the equation competition with fishermen. And you can ask any fisherman from Washington or Alaska how foraging competition with marine mammals has worked in their fisheries, and it has not worked very well. And it just concerns me that if this amendment as written is implemented, I believe it could be used to pressure the Secretary, the regional councils, and the coastal states to extend MMPA area protections irrespective of the stock condition of the mammal in question.
Let's move back to 6491, and I'm particularly interested in how the legislation would interact with essential fish habitat consultations. As you know, Chair Huffman has separate legislation that would completely change the consultation process for actions that potentially impact essential fish habitat. With that in mind, would 6491 make the consultation process more complicated?
Well, the salmon bill appears to apply the current marine EFH designation and consultation processes to inland salmon habitat. So I think just on its face, yes, increasing the Noaa footprint upland would increase the complication. But you ask an interesting question, Mr. Benson, that is when you bring in HR 4690, the Magnuson reauthorization bill, which I think will be before your subcommittee probably in April, that bill makes substantive aggressive changes to the current EFH designation and consultation processes. And I think that bill, combined with the salmon bill, will make the process far more complicated and invasive.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Levin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Redfern, marine mammals are not just an essential part of my district's coastal ecosystems, but also contribute to our local economy. I'm proud to represent Dana Point, California, which is the dolphin and whale watching capital of the world and is only one of 4 whale heritage sites in the world. Rep. Larson's bill, H.R. 6987, enhances ongoing conservation, science, and technology measures in order to protect and conserve marine mammals. How do you think the expansion of these protections will help protect our vulnerable marine mammals from increasing threats?
Thank you for that question. And I'm going to start by addressing the provision to expand monitoring of ocean soundscapes, because I did some research right in the waters off of Southern California, where I was looking at the risk of noise from vessels to whales. In that research, we used predictions of noise throughout the area, and that was what we used to look at overlap with whales. And when you're using predictions from a model in management or to address conservation questions, it's really important to understand how accurate your predictions are. So we try to compare our predictions to real-world measurements. And we only had access to 2 sources of measurements, and they were only for 1 month. And so it was really hard to match those to our predictions. So one of the things I like so much about expanding our soundscape monitoring is that we'll be able to do a much better job of verifying these predictions from ocean noise models. In general, it will just help us better understand ocean noise. What are the contributors? Where is it highest? Where is it lowest? And we can use all of that information to better manage this important source of noise into the ocean and to mitigate it. I also really like the near real-time monitoring provision. I'm excited about that. I know there's a pilot project for right whales, and I know we can use it for vessel strike, but it also has broader applications. And as I mentioned, I think a lot about wind energy. If we think about, you have wind energy developers out on the water, they are getting ready to drive the pile into the ocean seafloor. That's going to create a lot of noise. We want to know if a right whale is in the zone that's going to be impacted by that noise. If so, you can have the developers use all of their mitigation techniques to make sure we quiet that sound and we minimize our impacts. So those are just 2 examples of some of the really important provisions that are in H.R. 6987.
Thank you for that. And that real-time or near real-time monitoring mitigation, that's fairly similar to the Whale Safe program on the West Coast, is it not?
Yes, it is. It is. And I'm really glad you brought up Whale Safe. If I can add, one of the components of Whale Safe that I like so much is the habitat modeling component, where you're using your best information about ocean conditions to understand whether you expect a lot of whales to be in the area or just a few whales. It's like predicting the weather. Do I expect it to rain, and what's the chance of that? And we can use that information, again, to understand what sort of mitigation techniques might be necessary.
That's fantastic. Well, I can't say enough about the role that marine mammals have played in our local economy, particularly in Dana Point, as I mentioned. And I just want to thank you for all the great work that you're doing with conservation and technology to protect and conserve marine mammals. And we look forward to supporting you however we can. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. And Mr. Case of Hawaii has lodged an objection to your claim that you represent the whale and dolphin watching capital of the world, but we're going to table that objection for now.
We'll have to address this later, Mr. Chairman.
All right. We'll now recognize Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Honigman, I'd like to return to questions that I asked Ms. Coit about the existing vessel speed reduction initiatives. My understanding that even with the Blue Whale, Blue Skies program, which is a voluntary incentive-based program, that we still only raised the compliance rate to about 50%. So my first question to you is, how are we going to design programs that really effectively reduce vessel strikes and whale mortality while maintaining the needs and the priorities of our maritime economy. As you pointed out in your testimony, 90% of the goods are transported, that come into this country, are transported by ship. And we know that the ports of LA, Long Beach bring in somewhere between 30 and 40%. And as we all saw, those supply chain issues, the lineup of ships trying to get in this year into the ports has been staggering. So we know there's a tremendous volume out there. The question is, how do we really effectively reduce vessel strikes and whale mortality while maintaining the needs and priorities of our maritime economy?
Well, thank you for that question. And in the Navy, we used to have a rule that we called the law of maximum displacement, which is that little things get out of the way of big things. In this case, I think what we need is the ability to know in real time where a whale is and to be able to communicate in real time that information to where big things are so they can get out of the way of little things effectively. It's hard to maneuver ships. They're big. They need to have area, time, and speed to get out of the way of whales. So for me, the most important thing is knowing where whales are, communicating in real time to the ships that are nearby in real time so they can maneuver effectively out of the way of whales.
My other question is, getting back to what I mentioned before, those vehicle speed reduction programs. Do you believe that voluntary incentive-based will work? I know you've talked about we need to have the technology to be able to know where those whales are, but should we be mandatorily reducing speeds whenever they're near the coast of, and I'm mostly concerned about the West Coast, or are there voluntary programs? We know when they get real close to the ports of LA and Long Beach, especially in Long Beach, within 40 miles, they have what is called the Green Flag program, where if they reduce their speeds to 12 knots or below, they get a huge compliance, 90 to 95% compliance rate. However, they get tremendous reductions in their wharfage fees. So it really pays for them to reduce it. I don't know if we can do that everywhere, or should we be doing mandatory kinds of programs?
My view is baby steps before major steps. The legislation incentivizes ports to think about creating programs that will mitigate vessel strikes, including reduction of speeds and giving incentives by reducing port fees in other ways to incentivize ships. I think it makes sense to measure the effectiveness of those approaches before we think about mandatory speed reductions. But in my view, there's a narrow window to measure those effects, and it may be down the road that mandatory reductions are more necessary.
Thank you. I'm going to quickly ask Dr. Redfern, can you speak to what the loss of a single female right whale of reproductive age would mean for the right whale population? You only have 20 seconds.
So I'm deeply concerned about the status of the right whale population. Through the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the allowable number that we can afford to lose of right whales is less than 1. If you make that one a breeding female, you've lost an incredible opportunity for this species. So I'm deeply concerned about it, and I don't think we can afford to lose even 1 breeding female.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for the questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days after the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 days to allow for responses. If there's no further business before the subcommittee, without objection, then we stand adjourned.
Well done.
Thank you.